This is a production of PBS Charlotte.
This week on Off the Record, a new timetable, new costs, and new controversy for the future of Charlotte's transit system. New training for Charlotte-Mecklenburg police as cops balance how they deal with crooks versus how they deal with customers. Also, how more affordable housing for Charlotte's lowest income zip code could actually force out some low-income neighbors. And Old Charlotte versus New Charlotte. Is development along the Blue Line putting some of Charlotte's oldest businesses out of business? Plus, no charges against a federal marshal who shot and killed the suspect. No underage vaping in North Carolina anymore. No city council election this year. And no more plastic bags for your yard waste. Lots to talk about next on PBS Charlotte. And from our PBS Charlotte studios in historic Plaza Midwood, I'm Jeff Sonnier, and we're off the record talking about the stories you've been talking about this week. And if you watch the news, read the news, and listen to the news, well, you'll recognize the names and faces around our virtual table. Mark Becker from WSOC-TV, Eli Portillo from the UNC Charlotte Urban Institute, and Danielle Shemtub from Axios Charlotte. You can also join the conversation. Just email your questions and comments to offtherecord@WTVI.org. Well, I guess this week we'll pick up kind of where we left off last week, talking about the city's bid for a new mobility tax, new transit expansion, new ways for folks to get around and hopefully become more upwardly mobile from an economic standpoint as well. But it's going to cost more. It's going to take longer. Eli, you're kind of our transportation guy. You want to start us off this week?
Sure. This week we got a presentation from city officials to Charlotte City Council that started to fill in some of those question marks around the new transit plan. The latest estimate is about $13.5 billion in cost. That's a bit above the previous estimated range of $8 to $12 billion. And the timetable, to me, was a little more surprising than the cost, because you kind of expect in these big projects there's going to be cost increases. The timetable now has things like the Silver Line coming online in the late 2030s and completion of this plan in 2040 or so. So we're looking at a long time horizon. And that's if the city is able to get the transit tax approved by the legislature to go on the ballot and then approved by voters next year to start in 2023. So we're looking at more details, estimates, but I think there's still just a lot that could change. And that was something that the consultants working with City Council emphasized repeatedly. This is still really early in actually implementing this plan. So I think we're going to see a lot more questions come up over the next year or so as the city hashes this out and tries to get this 1 cent sales tax for transit and transportation on the ballot before voters next year.
Yeah, the more we know, the harder it seems to be to get that tax. I know that, as you mentioned, the timetable, 8 to 10 years was initially the target date for all of this. Now we're talking about 18 to 20 years as a build-out date, and it is, I guess, it makes that harder to sell to taxpayers, to sell to lawmakers in Raleigh when you're talking about something that really doesn't feel reachable for a lot of taxpayers and voters, I suppose.
And you know, Jeff, you and I are the resident historians here, and boy, you remember the Blue Line. Listen, the train runs great. It runs fast, but nothing about getting here was fast. And this, again, I'm not surprised that they said now it's going to be 20 years instead of 10 years or so. I mean, realistically, and I would say there's still a 50-50 chance or even less. And I don't want to be the downer here, but based on history, it was tough getting that sales tax approved before. And I think the atmosphere, the climate, political climate, has only gotten tougher. So I think there's a pretty good chance that we'll never see all of this. And there's a reasonable chance we won't see much of it. 20 years from now, we're going to stand back and say, you know, remember that? Yeah, whatever happened to that? I hate to be a pessimist here, but I think that's probably a realistic view.
And you've still got hurdles like the Red Line, for example. You still don't have the support of the northern towns, and the Red Line is still a hallmark of the plan. So, it remains to be seen kind of what's going to happen with that. Norfolk Southern has still not expressed any interest in working with the city at all. So, there's so many different hurdles between the General Assembly before this even can remotely become a reality.
And that was actually exactly the situation when they first laid out a transit plan with 5 lines, and I couldn't even tell you when it was, probably 30 years ago. And the Red Line was going up to, Davidson via Cornelius and Huntersville and the other towns. And Norfolk Southern said, we don't really want to let you guys use the line. And the towns weren't wild about it, and it never happened. We're right back to the future, right back to where we were. And I'm not sure what's different this time.
Tariq,
the way.
sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Elon.
The way the mayor put it, she said something to the effect of 18 years is a long time, but if we don't start this now, pretty soon we'll be talking problem of every year you wait, construction costs, land costs in a growing city like Charlotte only go up. There's other cities competing for the federal funding that would need to cover part of this plan. There are, there's no certainty that we'll get the full sales tax, and it could be a half cent instead of 1 cent. So I think we're in a situation where the longer we wait and the longer this goes on, it's not going to get easier. It's only going to get more difficult.
Yeah, let me touch on that for just a second. You talked about federal funding. I know there's a lot of folks who have a sense of urgency on this particular project because of the Biden infrastructure plan. They see an opportunity right here, right now, to get money that might not be available in the future and hasn't been available so much in the past. Until you get your political ducks in a row, until you get everybody on board, you're really not in line to get that funding, are you? I guess that's why there's a real sense at City Hall among the folks pushing this mobility tax plan to try to get as many people on board as quickly as possible because, I hate to use the metaphor here, but the train might be leaving the station when it comes to federal funding.
But Jeff, I think
John
you just hit on
Lewis
something. Go ahead, Elon.
Oh, I'm sorry. Really quickly, John Lewis said last week that that's a priority for them has been to be first in line for that funding at the head of the line. But, we heard from Carolyn Flowers, former CATS official and now a consultant on this project this week, that what they're hearing from federal officials are that there are a lot of requests out there. The federal funds are stretched and, it's not necessarily a slam dunk. So I think there is kind of that sense of urgency driving some of this. There's a lot of other cities that want this money, and there's not that much money, even if a new big infrastructure bill passes. It's not infinite.
Yeah, and so, Jeff, I think you hit on something that may actually work against the project here, and that is the Biden infrastructure program. Absolutely. If it's all up to federal dollars, that's one thing. But again, if you have to go through a state legislature to get stuff approved, all politics are national now as opposed to local, I think, because now that state legislature, which is largely and not overwhelmingly Republican, is going to see this as perhaps a political win for the Democrats and for Biden. If we have to go through the legislature to get approval for a sales tax, I think they would dig in their heels, probably partially on principle, because it could be perceived as a Democratic win. I just think the politics will get in the way here.
Politics always seems to get in the way at City Council, and especially when they're dealing with a state legislature that doesn't always agree with the city's priorities. But again, this is a long way from being settled. And one of the things that the City Council will need before they get anything on the ballot will be an actual city election to have it on the ballot with. And we found out also this week from City Council that there won't be a city election this year, not because they can't have one, at least on the at-large and mayor side, but because the cost of doing 2 elections, districts this year, at-large this year, districts next year. Kind of complicated. Anyone want to just kind of clarify for us why council is waiting an extra year and giving themselves an extra year in office before they have another election?
So this all came up because of the census data being delayed. So they're not going to get the census data in time to draw the districts. So they had to postpone. The state passed a law actually postponing all municipal elections that were scheduled for 2021 to the spring of 2022. But what the city had to decide was whether to split them up and do the at-large races and the mayor in the fall as planned, and then do the district races in the spring. There was an argument on one side saying that if, you elect people for a certain amount of time, you should have an election, keep them accountable, that kind of thing. And then the other side was basically saying that, this could be confusing for voters, it could cost more money. The Black Political Caucus came out against it, saying that it could be a form of suppression because people, would be confused, wouldn't know how to, or wouldn't, understand that they have to vote in two different elections. So ultimately, that camp won, and we're going to have all city elections in spring of 2022.
Yeah, it's going to be, that's what we need, more elections, right? But it's going to be a big ballot in 2022, not just city council, county commission, state races. There's just going to be a lot for voters to consider. And again, we don't know yet if the mobility tax will be there or not, but stay tuned. We'll be talking about that, I'm sure, in weeks and shows to come. Mark, let me ask you about the police chief this week, finally launching what we've talked about before, this customer service training. I think the paper ran a headline calling it Chick-fil-A of police departments. Will they be open Sundays? That's what I'm asking.
It better be. Chief Jennings actually used that analogy, right? When he was talking about it. And look, on the surface, it makes sense, right? Police interact with the public. Now, what we hear about, what we report about, frankly, are often those situations that are, full of tension and sometimes go wrong. But there are many, 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 and I think Chief Jennings put it like 500,000. They track these things, actually, interactions with the public every year. And, you want most of those to go well, and I think it makes sense, right? But the optics, you got a little bit of criticism because it sounds like maybe we're trying to be trying too hard to be the good cop, and the bad cop, the good cop, bad cop thing. But look, if it helps, if you can build relationships even in the smallest ways, and deal with attitudes of officers in how they interact with the public, it's all good. I really think. And the cost was brought up. There's some consulting fee and all that, but it's a nominal cost, I think. It doesn't cost much. I know the FOP wasn't thrilled about spending $60,000, but in the big budget, and I'm not sure that's the number, but in the big picture budget, that's not a lot of money for the police department or the city. So I think this is a positive thing. Is it the be all end all? No, but it's a good thing. It's hard to find fault with it, I think.
Yeah, this week, City Council also approved spending almost $1 million to purchase new handguns to replace aging service weapons for Charlotte-Mecklenburg police officers. So, it's not like force and that aspect of policing is going away. I think we've seen so many of the incidents in the last several years, not just year plus, but really the last 4 or 5 years. So many racial incidents and use of force incidents that seem to start from routine interactions that take a turn. That's happened so often, and not just here in Charlotte, but nationally. I think you're really seeing a push to kind of address that, and this general sense of, yes, we're going to have to use force sometimes, but a routine interaction with the public should be routine. That shouldn't be what is taking turns and really going bad, if at all avoidable. It's be polite, be nice, be courteous. It's all basic human stuff you learn in kindergarten, right? I mean, but I know I've seen times when officers, have been, they get very abrupt very quickly because they're taught to be in charge and trained to be in charge of a situation. But you don't have to be, negative or a real hardline person to
get control of the situation. So I think it's a basic building block, and it's an attitude and it's a culture thing, I think is probably the right word that CMPD is trying to do. And they're saying they're the first in the country to do this. So we'll see how it goes.
You know, a 4-hour training session, I'm not sure that changes culture, but it does send a message to the community, at least on the part of the new police chief, that that they're trying to do something. And
exactly.
Whether it's fully successful or not, maybe that message is the most important thing of all here, that that the department isn't just not just cops and robbers, but it's cops and customers sometimes too. Danielle, you wrote a story this week about affordable housing that might actually hurt the people it's trying to help. It's, you know, a lot of trade-offs in terms of trying to get things built and the cost of getting things built. We're talking about what used to be called the Housing Partnership is now called Dream Key. But tell us about the controversy in Druid Hills that's going on between them and the neighbors.
Yeah, so Dream Key has long been building in Druid Hills and in many other areas in Charlotte, in sort of the traditional crescent, so to speak, the lower income, majority minority part of the city. And Druid Hills is actually changing very rapidly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this dynamic kind of centers around the fact that housing prices have gone up, I believe, 111% in the last 5 years there. One of the fastest increases of any zip code in the city. So, you know, Dream Key essentially owns about 24 lots right now in the area, and they're redeveloping. They're going to build 11 homes that are affordable. So in order to finance the construction of those homes, they're saying they're going to sell 13 lots to a market rate developer, essentially. And that's got the neighborhood upset because, you know, they essentially understood this to be all affordable homes on all 24 of those lots. I think that what the big takeaway is, you know, one, just the changing dynamics of how expensive it is to build housing, to have to find a revenue source to be able to build homes for what's going to be 80% of the area median income, home ownership opportunities. And so, you know, they're trying to find some revenue sources, but at the same time, you know, you've got very limited land left, and you've got so many developers going into that neighborhood, tearing down houses, building huge, you know, $300,000, $400,000 homes. And that's accelerating gentrification. So the neighborhood's fear is, you know, hey, Dream Key, are you coming in and selling these homes to a developer and then helping, you know, fuel that gentrification, as opposed to providing another 13 homes that could be affordable. But again, you know, they say that they don't have the money to have them all be affordable.
I know when they were the housing partnership, that's a challenge they've talked about in the past, trying to keep up with the private developers in establishing housing for folks who need the housing, who can't afford the private, you know, developed housing. And they've got a track record. Obviously, they've been there for decades in Druid Hills, which is, by the way, traditionally in the lowest income zip code in Charlotte. So we're talking about, you know, the folks who really need housing they can afford. But, you know, they're kind of caught in the same, you know, in the same trap, if you will, that a lot of other neighborhoods and a lot of other organizations are. And that is, you know, can we afford to build for people who need it, you know, while the costs of building are rising so quickly? Yeah, it's a tough call.
It's a balancing act, right? I mean, I think it's something that will continue to be an issue, but it's really about balancing the ability to build those affordable homes, and at the same time realize that the builders have expenses too. You know, I mean,
and you know, I think the specter of neighborhoods like Cherry looms large over this. Cherry, you know, historic African American neighborhood just east of Charlotte, and it was once owned by an entity that rented out homes affordably. Ownership changed hands in a long disputed transaction, and eventually almost all of those houses in Cherry, a huge number of them, were torn down and replaced with giant lot line to lot line bungalows that sell for $1 million now. So there's precedent for these concerns in Villa Heights, but the balancing act that Mark mentioned is really real, and construction prices are skyrocketing. So it's a really, really tough situation.
Yeah, it's a big problem playing out on a small scale in one neighborhood, but it's a problem that other neighborhoods have shared as well. And I don't know that there's an answer today or, in the near future, but it's something we keep talking about because it keeps getting on our radar here in Charlotte as a problem. We heard, speaking of things that keep getting on our radar, we heard about Zack's Hamburgers this week, closing on South Boulevard after 50 plus years in business, coming right on the heels of Price's Chicken Coop also closing. It kind of raises, neither owner talked about, the changes that have happened along the Blue Line and South Boulevard as being an influence in their decision to close. But, is it a coincidence that these older businesses that have been there forever, that were there before, light rail came and turned the whole area around? Is light rail that was supposed to help these businesses also maybe forcing them out because of all the growth that it's bringing to the table? I don't know if this is a transit question or a growth and development question. So Eli and Danielle, I'll let you kind of fight it out first.
Well, the transit folks will always say transit is about economic development as much as moving people. So yeah, there's a link. I think, in addition to land prices going up and making it more attractive to sell, another common denominator we've seen here is, these places have been run by families, individuals. I think the owner of Zack's talked about, decades of 14, 15-hour days. These are labors of love as much as they are community institutions. And, when you have someone who's been doing that for decades, and then someone else comes in and offers a 7-figure payday, retirement starts to look a lot more attractive. I just think, unless there is some way to subsidize not just the monetary cost of operating these businesses, but also really that time and labor cost, none of them last forever. And to have them all happen at once, I know it's been a big identity hit that people are really feeling right now.
Yeah, I think this is the crux of development and, quote unquote progress in Charlotte. We have all the new buildings going up in South End and everything is shiny and new. And so I think it hurts a lot for people to see, like you said, the institutions that kind of make up the character of the city be gone. So I think the question is how do you, is there a way, like Eli said, to keep some of them around or to, kind of pass them down? Obviously, there have been a lot of adaptive reuse projects around town. So they're at least, keeping some old buildings and maybe finding a new purpose for them as opposed to tearing things down. I think this is a really big question that gets at the issue a lot of people bring up of, Charlotte tears down all of its history.
Heard that before.
Yeah.
And it was Mr. K's before all of this, right? A few months ago, Mr. K's right there on South Boulevard. Look, affordable eating, that may be our next topic, right? It is. I think it's everything you've said. It's just the development and the issue is growth. And, these are family-run businesses. And, to Eli's point, other people get tired. If this were a corporate thing, it's not because they're not making money, I think.
You can still get a hamburger on South Boulevard, but now it's a $15 hamburger instead of a $5 hamburger. So it's that. I guess that's the difference as a city like ours gets bigger, and that intersection of, long hours and operating on the edge and a big payday offered by these developers who would love to see that land turn into something new. I don't think this is. I guess we're running out of businesses that can go out of business, but I don't think we've heard the end of this kind of story where these old family businesses move on in part because of what's happening all around them. Mark, let me come back to you real quick to talk about the DA's decision this week on the Frankie Jennings shooting. It was not a police shooting, a U.S. Marshal shooting, but a lot of the same issues that we've seen in the past here in town.
Yeah, and I was out there that day, and it's tough. And I think the biggest takeaway on this one is we don't really know what happened. And one of the reasons we don't know what happened is because the federal marshals have not worn body cameras to this point, and we're told they're going to be getting them. I think the move was actually on long before the shooting to get body cameras on those folks. But there is a video from the store, and I watched it. It's a camera positioned outside the store, but as is often the case when when agents move in and police move in and make these takedowns of this guy who, Frankie Jennings, who had warrants and had some serious charges that they were trying to arrest him on. They swoop in and they move cars in front of the camera. You can't see what happens, is the bottom line. He had a gun in the car somewhere, and the car was moving, slightly, and perhaps the agents were at risk, and that's the reason that the district attorney said the shooting was not a criminal shooting. Now the families are still trying will come forward with some civil action, but the bottom line is we couldn't see what happened. And it's time for these folks to get body cameras because they're in highly leveraged, volatile situations. They need them.
Yep. In our last minute, we're not going to have time to cover that vape lawsuit settlement. That's a big story, but it's a story we can talk about in the future. I do want to talk about something that is happening this week, and that's the end of plastic bags for your yard waste. Paper or plastic used to be at the grocery store. Now it's on the front lawn, I suppose. Another sign of progress in Charlotte, I suppose, right?
I'm a bucket man. I have reusable containers. I bought them once. I don't have to go to the store to buy any kind of bags. So I'm a bucket guy all the way.
All right. Well,
Just don't kick the bucket.
no, we're kick the bucket guys.
Fill the bucket. Don't kick the bucket.
Yeah, but again, it makes sense from an environmental point of view. If you're bagging the recyclables in something that isn't quite as recyclable, it does cause more work. And I'm guessing there'll be a run on paper bags at the big box stores this weekend and going forward. But just another little change that shows how Charlotte's growing, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the not so much better. Yeah. Hey, we're out of time, folks. I really appreciate the discussion this week. We covered a lot of topics, and I always appreciate your presence with us at home as well. Hope you enjoyed our conversation this week, and anytime you want to join us, just email your questions and comments to offtherecord@wtvi.org. Thanks again for being here this week, and we'll see you next time on Off the Record.
A production of PBS Charlotte.